It's a mistake to mistake the undertow for the wave. We have had a wave of ongoing progress and revolutions that have helped human beings enormously over the last hundreds of years. They do produce undertows, they do produce backlashes.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battlelines.
I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
On today's episode, I speak to journalist and author Fareed Zakaria about why he believes America and the West are entering a new age of revolution. And we check in with Nicole Smith, our correspondent in Israel, about how domestic political turmoil and the ongoing war in Gaza is threatening Benjamin Netanyahu's government. It's Friday, June the 21st. Revolutions. They're the dramatic, often blood-soaked milestones of history, the moments of sudden change when the old order is to be replaced with something strange and new. They're the political revolutions, the abrupt overthrow of states and regimes driven by mass protest and sometimes extreme violence. We think of America in 1776, France in 1789, Russia in 1917. And then there are the cultural, economic, and technological revolutions that change the way we think about ourselves and how we live. The classic example is the 19th century Industrial Revolution. But we're used to thinking of these as episodes from the past. What if we now are entering our own age of revolutions? And how dangerous could that be? Today we speak to Fareed Zakaria, who's authored a book with that very thesis. And I asked him about what the past teaches about our own revolutionary moment, and given the violence that often accompanies revolution, how alarmed we should be. I'm joined now by Fareed Zakaria, needs no introduction really, journalist, political commentator, author, dare I say it, bit of a public intellectual. Is that?
As long as it doesn't sound too suspicious, I'm happy to take the accolade.
You've written a new book. It's called Age of Revolutions. Basically, it's the history of Western revolutions in the Western world. Unashamedly, it's about the Western world. Over the past 4 centuries ago, you look at the Dutch and English in the 17th century, the French in the 18th, the industrial revolutions of the 19th century. And your basic contention, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're living through another one now, or at least America and perhaps the rest of the world is certainly at risk of one. Could you just talk us through your theory, the way you see this moment, and these 3 common themes you talk about, economics, technology, and identity, and how they're informing the change that we're seeing right now?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. So you're right. The central contention of the book, and I trace it historically, is that if you look over the past 400 years, we've had these periods where you have enormous technological change, transformed society, enormous economic change, the rise and acceleration of globalization, transformed societies. These 2 structural revolutions almost always produce a kind of identity revolution because people start to it changes the way people think. And then that produces a backlash over time. And so if you look at the Dutch, which I begin with, the Dutch really are the first country in Europe to break out of the millennia of poverty by innovating. They innovate in terms of land management, water management. They invent tall ships, navigation, globalization. They invent financial leaves. So they have the first joint stock company, the Dutch East India Company, the first stock exchange, and they become the richest country in Europe. That then makes them think of themselves differently. They think of themselves no longer as part of the Habsburg Empire, but they think of themselves as Dutch, distinct national identity. They think of themselves not as part of Catholic Europe, but rather a very distinctive Protestant nation. And all of that then accelerates the country so far forward that it starts to produce, and there was a party called the States Party that became, represented what I call the politics of nostalgia. The idea we're going to go back. This is all too much change. We've unsettled the old ways. We're going to take you back to when it was all simpler. We're going to make the Netherlands great again. And that cycle of massive forward movement, transformation, identity revolution, and then backlash is one we are watching, I think, in much of the world today, as we've gone through these tremendous revolutions of information technology, globalization.
I mean, it is quite remarkable. There's lots of specifics to get into. I suppose that my big question, really, to get it out of the way first, is that revolutions are bloody things. You talk about how You posit that the Dutch and English revolutions were relatively successful. They worked out. You say that the French one failed because it gave rise to autocracy and bloodletting and war, and eventually you got the monarchy back. But even in the Dutch and English cases, there's a lot of people die. There's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of war. Is that what we're heading for right now? Is that what you're saying we need to be braced for?
It is no question that in the past it has often been accompanied by a lot of violence and turmoil, partly because these tectonic shifts also have a geopolitical effect. And we're seeing that too right now. We're in the middle of a geopolitical revolution, the return of great power politics, the return of great power conflict that we had really been absent since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Whether it will inevitably lead to conflict, I don't know. I'm not one to believe too much in kind of inevitability. I think we have a lot of agency, and how we navigate through these periods is enormously important. In fact, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I think that there are better and worse ways to navigate through this. But look, we're already going through, if you think about it, we're watching two wars and one region of deep tension entirely related to all this. In Ukraine, Russia is challenging the basic liberal international order that was set up after 1945. In the Middle East, Iran effectively and its proxies are challenging the basic security system that has been put in place. And in East Asia, the Chinese, not through war, but through relentless economic expansion, are trying to replace America and its allies as the kind of dominant powers in the region. So you're already facing real great power conflict. We do have it's a different world. History never repeats itself precisely. We have nuclear weapons and therefore nuclear deterrence, and that means perhaps a real superpower war is highly unlikely. But we're definitely in an age of revolution.
Mm. I mean, there is, as you say, there's the geopolitical, the way geopolitics has changed. You talk about the rise of the rest, and you also talk about, you talk about how lots of countries have now kind of caught up with the West. This era when Britain, the Netherlands, the United States, Europe in general enjoyed this kind of insane, kind of crazy supremacy in just economic might, technological might, military might. That lead has been eroded massively. But you also talk about how, we're looking at a post-American world, because not only has that happened, but America is for that reason both less supreme and also less interested in playing an international role. I know you wrote about post-American world some years ago, actually. Do you think that this current cycle of American isolationism is a decisive one, that America is not going to come back from this and the world needs to get used to it?
It's a hinge election for precisely the reason you point out. It's important for me to say, the post-American world is not fundamentally a product of American decline. The United States is doing fine. The United States is actually, at this point, the best performing major economy in the world. Our technology companies dominate the world. Our banks dominate the world. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world. But what's happened, as you say, is the sort of rise of the rest, so that the world is much less manageable, because it's not just the Chinas and Russias and Irans. It's the Indias and Brazils and Turkeys and Indonesias that are all rich enough, powerful enough, confident enough that they won't be bossed around. You could look at Turkey as a perfect example. This is a country that used to routinely just do whatever Washington told it to do 30 years ago. Today, the economy is 5 times the size it was 30 years ago. It's a confident country, and it routinely tells Washington to go stuff it when it asks for, when Washington tells it what to do. So that reality is the new one. And layered on top of it, as you say, is this crucial issue that I think in some ways may be the crucial geopolitical issue of the moment, which is the United States willing to play the role that it has played since 1945 as creator, sustainer, banker, security guarantor of the open international system that it created after 1945. I think in that regard, the election in November is really a pretty stark contrast. Biden deeply believes in that order. Trump, I think, has an essentially transactional attitude. He's fundamentally, I think, reflexively an isolationist. And we haven't had one since 1945, like a real isolationist president. But, the first term, he wasn't able to do as much as he wanted. He was surrounded by the old Republican internationalists, and so they kind of limited the degree to which he could do things. Will a second term be different? Probably. I think, and he represents a much larger group. And so I do think that there's a real danger that for the first time since 45, the United States says, we're tired of bearing this burden. We're going to go home. We're going to retreat to a fortress America. And then, that will have a much larger spin-on effect, I think, than people realize. The countries in Eastern Europe will scramble to think about their own security. Even in Asia, countries like Australia, which have stuck their necks out and taken on a very confrontational position with China on the assumption that the United States has their back, are going to wonder, did we make the right choice? Would it be easier to cut a deal with China? So you can imagine the security systems in lots of different areas unraveling because you've lost that backstop that America represented.
Which would, of course, be a revolutionary moment. I mean, it brings us into kind of, I want to ask you more about elections in a moment, but you talk about this change in identity and massive progress and then the backlash. Now, I think what you're saying is kind of, the rise of populism, things like Donald Trump's first election in the United States, the Brexit vote in Britain represent to a degree a bit of that backlash.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I mean, Trump, Brexit, it's the retreat of two, Britain and the United States, two of the historic leaders of this liberal globalized order that you talk about that, begins with the Dutch in the 17th century. Quite historic. But is that retreat, was it inevitable given the rise of the rest, given what's going on? Or are you saying it's an own goal created by a few key actors?
I don't believe these things are inevitable. There was inevitably going to be a backlash. There was inevitably going to be a rise of populism. But did it have to take the form it did? No, I think, let's take those two examples. David Cameron handled the whole issue of Brexit disastrously. He made a terrible decision. Britain has historically never been ruled by referendum. The idea of subjecting this to a referendum was a very bad idea for Britain. He was trying to solve a problem he had within the Conservative Party. And another way to have handled it would have been to try to cauterize it within the party. There were 100 ways you could have done it. First of all, it's not clear that you needed to do it at all. I mean, George Osborne argued for a different strategy. You could have expelled a few of the members who were clamoring for it. They would have joined UKIP. Who knows? You know what I mean? There's a path you can easily see with no Brexit referendum. Similarly, with Donald Trump, to begin with, 150,000 voters in 4 states voting differently would have given you a different outcome. Had Jill Stein, one of those third-party candidates who got enough votes to sway it, could have made different. Hillary could have run a better campaign, campaigned in those states which she neglected. So I think there are all kinds of things that you can imagine, and in a way, that's part of the larger point I'm making, which is that if the forces of openness and if of the forces of liberalism, and I now mean liberalism broadly construed, the forces that believe in the kind of liberal Enlightenment Project and liberal democracy, if they want to win, to persevere, to endure, they have to be smart about it. They have to figure out how to navigate this period, and it is not given that they will win. There is a tendency liberals have, I think, to be complacent and believe that history is on their side. Well, look at the French Revolution. It didn't work out so well.
I mean, talking about that, you talked about the pivot American election. This is quite a year of elections, really. We've had India and Mexico already. We've got France, the UK coming up, and the US in November. You're talking in very big global terms already. Are there any trends you can identify there? What are you expecting from the outcome of this year?
Well, in Britain, you see a very interesting contest along the lines that kind of plays out some of the themes of the book. So on the right, what you are seeing is the struggle to figure out whether or not the right is going to adjust to this rise of populism or not, right? Basically, what you're seeing is the Conservative Party in free fall because it doesn't really know what it believes in. Think of the Conservative Party over the last 15 years. It tried European-style classic Tory fiscal austerity, a kind of German conservative model, if you will, under Cameron and Osborne. Then it tried Trumpian-style populism, Brexit plus big spending under Boris Johnson. Then it tried Thatcherite libertarian economics very briefly under Liz Truss. And I would argue in some ways Rishi Sunak continues that experiment somewhat. And now it doesn't really know what it believes in, which is why Farage has been able to rise because he says, okay, I'll tell you what I believe in. I am very clear on the spectrum that I describe, the new spectrum of politics, which is really, are you in favor of more openness or more closedness? Farage says, oh, I'm in favor of closeness. I want less immigration. I want less multiculturalism. I want less diversity. I want less integration with Europe in every sense of the word. And because he stands for that, he's draining away a lot of the conservative vote. So the conservatives face a kind of Peelite moment, like 1846, when Robert Peel split the conservatives over essentially the same issue, open versus closed, free trade versus protectionism. They'll have to figure out what happens. And if they remain split in the way in which they are now between those who believe more in that closed vision, who are going to end up voting for Farage, and those who don't, they'll suffer the fate that the Conservative Party suffered in the 19th century when Peel split the party on free trade, which is after 1846 for 28 years. There was no conservative majority, and the conservatives were in the wilderness politically for 28 years. That's the longest period they've ever been out of power, and you could imagine something like that happening. On the liberal side, I think Keir Starmer is being very clever. He's occupied the center ground. He's occupied a position of saying, I'm the responsible party. We're going to be careful on spending and taxes. And as a result, has pushed the Tories more and more to the right, where they have to make this decision. So Starmer, to me, represents the kind of intelligently navigating through this by not giving in to the radicals. He's actually handled the Labour Party quite brilliantly, I think, managed to shut down the Corbyn wing, shut down anti-Semitism. He'll face a governing problem, which is at some point he's going to have to spend money to get growth. But basically, that's how I see the British election.
Let me try and turn it around. I'm just wondering who are the revolutionaries here, because you seem to be saying that the Trumps, the Nigel Farages, the Marine Le Pens of these worlds, these are counter-revolutionaries. These are the people who want to turn back the clock into what used to be a closed thing. But on the other hand, I mean, you seem to be describing that there's this established way of doing things, this globalized, quote-unquote, neoliberal consensus. Who are the revolutionaries? If this is a revolutionary moment, isn't it Trump's moment? Isn't it the Marine Le Pen's moment? Isn't it Farage's moment? Because really, all those things you're talking about, the transformation of technology, the impact that's had on the economy and how it's left people behind, what it's done to identity, the world has moved on from that. I was reading through the book and I thought, this is a defense of the Enlightenment Project. Exactly. Do you not worry that the Enlightenment Project is now yesterday's news? This is the moment. If this is a revolutionary moment when we kiss it goodbye.
So that is what I think the Trumps and the Farages and the Le Pens would say to you. And what I would say in return is, look at the world around us. I mean, the United States and China, this we take the most extreme example, do $2 billion worth of trade every day. Do you know what the peak trade between the United States and the Soviet Union was? In the height of the Cold War, it was $2 billion in an entire year. We trade that much with China every day. Do you look at the European Union and you see the most tightly integrated economic entity in history? If you look at tariffs around the industrial world, even with all the rise of protectionism, they're 3%. In 1975, they were 20%. In other words, we are living in a deeply, the revolution is ongoing. We are living in a deeply interdependent, globalized world. Information technology is transforming everything we do. You're not going to be able to roll back globalization. You're not going to be able to roll back the technological revolution. That we are living with the Enlightenment Project, with globalization. The key is that I think the agents of that revolution, of those revolutions, have to be wise in how they navigate through it. And what I'm saying is people like Starmer understand, I think instinctively, you can't push too far too fast. One of the messages of my book is you have to understand that this kind of change, these kind of revolutions, they're very disruptive for people. And we often tend not to realize that. People who are educated and urban and live in, and do pretty well economically, because we sort of surf along the waves of these changes. We're the beneficiaries of these changes. Many people are not. Many people are roiled by them. Are the disruption is enormous, and even when they get jobs, when they're not economically dispossessed, it's still they feel an enormous sense of anxiety because of all the change. This is the story of America in some ways. American unemployment is at a 50-year low. It's not that people who have been disrupted have not found jobs. It's that they've lost their settled way of life. And that can be deeply unsettling. You once lived in a steel town and you went to the same church and the same Rotary Club or Kiwanis Club and bowling league, and you hung out at the same hardware store and movie theater. And that's all gone away. And that's gone away because of a mixture of globalization and technology. So it's recognizing that people can only take so much change so fast.
You say we're living within, the Enlightenment Project. It's still there. We just got to work out how to deal with it. And yet, and you talk about people feeling a bit discombobulated, a little bit anxious about this and all this change. But it's not just anxiety, is it? It's about your material well-being. It's about stagnating economic growth. We're talking about kind of a rise of poverty. In Britain, we're seeing a return of things like whooping cough, for Christ's sake. Real serious senses of degradation that this new deal, whatever this is, this world, this project, it's not that people feel a little bit uneasy about it or something. It's that it's caused real physical impact on people. People have become poorer. People have become left behind, and therefore it's failed in a way.
Well, as I say, there's no question that these periods of revolutionary change produce this kind of disruption. They produce, for example, rising inequality, and the people who are doing well tend not to realize how much worse it is for people who are not doing well. And that's absolutely part of the story. But what I'm trying to say is it goes beyond economics. It's not just economics. For example, on the health stuff, just so you know, whatever anecdotes you may look at over the last 10 or 15 years, life expectancy, health outcomes in Europe have gone up quite markedly. So people are healthier, they're living longer. The US is a special case in that regard. But the US, even though it's doing well economically, has those some other manifestations. But take Northern Europe, for example, Scandinavia, the Netherlands. Those places are doing pretty well economically. They don't have a lot of inequality. And one of the hallmarks of Northern Europe is the lack of deep and rising inequality. And yet, Sweden now has as its second largest party, a party that openly traces its roots to 1940s fascism. The Netherlands has as its single largest party Geert Wilders' party. So it can't be that it's all about inequality, because those places are not particularly unequal. It's a broader phenomenon. It's cultural. A lot of it has to do with immigration, which is the kind of visible face of all these changes. So that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not disagreeing with you that there's been inequality and inequality of particularly of kind of standards of living. What I'm saying is that's all part of this mix, that there are one part of this, the way to think about this backlash is that it is a revolt of people who feel that over the last 30 years of all these changes, you have empowered a new ruling class. And that ruling class is basically meritocratic, urban, educated, secular, multicultural, cosmopolitan, and all the people who are not none of those things, who are more rural, less educated, less multicultural, less cosmopolitan, those people are revolting. And that's the common pattern. If by the way, if you want to look at elections in the US, in Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, even in Brazil, in Turkey, even in India to a certain extent, what Erdogan represents is the voice of the Anatolian masses feeling that Turkey had been run too long by a secular, cosmopolitan, liberal Istanbul elite. And this is a reaction to it. So that's, if you will, the one common theme here.
And your solution to this is not to reject the Enlightenment tradition and progress and so on. It's to not go too far. So you talk about how identity politics, shoving that down people's throat in the United States is counterproductive. For example, you talk about how Joe Biden has made compromises about imposing some kind of restrictions on the southern border. And you just talked about Keir Starmer navigating a way through that. So that's your kind of solution.
I think so. I think that, in each country, it may be that you have to navigate it somewhat differently. But broadly speaking, that's right. I don't want to give up on the Enlightenment and liberalism, which has empowered, people in 100 different ways. But I do want to recognize that it can be very disruptive, and you therefore have to be very careful about how you move these things forward.
I wanted to end on quite a provocative thought then. At the beginning of the book, you talk about the rise of the Dutch and how they did very well. But before that, you talk about Venice and how Venice all went a little bit wrong. And part of the reason it went wrong was kind of what you've just described, right? About this, you get an elite in the center in Venice. Everybody else in the empire is exploited and downtrodden. That's pretty much how I suppose the Donald Trumps of this world would describe the swamp or so on in America. Is it possible that America's gone too far down that road? It's an outlier on life expectancy. There is a clear, massive division between the coasts and the great central mass in terms of health, in terms of outlook, in terms of attitude. There is this strong sense that there is an almost, you call it meritocratic, but there's a sense that actually it's kind of a hereditary ruling class, isn't it? And you're not going to be part of that if you haven't got a legacy place at an Ivy League university and so on. Do you think America is in danger of not surviving this revolution, that this could actually be the end of the American project?
Well, so let's first, talk about Venice for a second. You've read the book very carefully, and you're right. There's that brief moment where Venice seems like it might be the beginning of the modern world, and it doesn't, because it becomes an empire, it becomes an oligopoly, becomes an oligarchy, and they have a very specific moment. I think it's in the 1390s when they pass a law which essentially entrenches a hereditary aristocracy. Before that, it had been quite meritocratic and was the first kind of modern merchant republic in that way. I think that would be a misreading of America. I think there are some tendencies in that regard which I worry about. But, the United States remains a kind of wide open, crazy meritocracy in the sense that, first of all, most admissions in those Ivy League schools you're talking about are merit-based. Yes, it's unfortunate that there are some exceptions to that. I don't remember, but something like 10 or 15% of the admissions are driven by whether your parents went to those schools, but 85% are not. And more importantly, look at America, look at the people, the technology world. It is dominated by college dropouts, by people who went to second-run colleges, all kinds of things. Look at the most valuable company in the world right now, NVIDIA, which is founded by Jensen Huang, who, as I recall, didn't go to a particularly impressive college at all. Zuckerberg dropped out, Gates dropped out. I mean, and that continues to be deeply true. Look, the thing about America that I honestly think Europeans find very hard to understand is it is a very dynamic, incredibly dynamic, entrepreneurial, innovative place with deep inequalities. It is a ragged society. It is a society that if you make it, you can live on a scale that nobody has ever imagined anyone could live. But if you don't make it, you fall through the cracks in a way that no other modern advanced industrial society would let you. And that's always been true. America has always been characterized by that reality. That's what the Wild West was all about. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm saying it would be a mistake to look at that and say that is the sign of American decline. Consider this. America now has 3 companies, the market value of which are larger than the entire German stock exchange. If you take the 7 largest American technology companies, their combined market value is larger than the entire market value of the countries of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Canada put together. And it's not just these big companies. America's real wages are now almost 60% higher than Europe's. They were about the same 30 years ago. American real wages are now above $70,000. The EU average is $45,000. If Britain were, as in Boris Johnson's fantasy, If Britain were to have become the 51st state of the United States, today it would be the 51st poorest state in America. Britain's per capita income is below Mississippi's right now. So America is always had this kind of amazing inventiveness and innovation, but for people, the bottom third of America, it's a much tougher life than it is in any other rich country. I don't think that's a sign of decline. That's a sign of the kind of peculiarity of American life.
If we take your theory, your reading of the scenario, Donald Trump is basically the anti-Enlightenment candidate, the candidate trying to roll back the progress of the past 400 years. Is he going to win in November? And if he does, how bad is it?
I think there's a very strong prospect he will, partly because of the peculiarity of the American electoral system. Remember, he lost by almost 8 million votes in the 2020 election. In any other presidential system that I know of, that would be it. We're the only ones who have this very peculiar system with the electoral college, which makes it close. But he represents a very substantial part of the country. In terms of a prediction, look, honestly, as in those 4 or 5 states, if you look at the polls right now, it's a statistical tie. There are states where Trump is leading, but it's within the margin of error. There are states where Biden is leading. It's within the margin of error. Right now, it looks like Trump has the edge. But as to whether it would be a big deal, I do think it would be a big deal, largely for the reason I mentioned internationally. I think Trump would, there's the prospect that Trump could really radically alter the nature of the international system, which I think in some ways has given so much oxygen to the free world and to these values of openness and liberalism. Domestically, I tend to think that that America is very strong and has very strong institutions. They stood up to him the last time. I think they'll stand up to him this time. He will try to outmaneuver them. And by the way, in some places he'll do things which are very radical on immigration and such, but those are totally constitutional. That's part of the that's part of the warp and woof of democratic life. If he does mass deportations and things like that, my own view is that the left should not use illiberal means to achieve liberal ends. That is not appropriate. I think that I'm against, for example, all these court cases against him, which I think, with one exception, are all, for the most part, either bogus or trivial. You have to recognize, I mean, there's a large part of the country that likes him. If he wins and he wants to implement some of those policies, that's fine. I'll disagree with them where I disagree with them, but that's democratic politics. And I hope that tames some of those furies. And, that we can, as I say, I don't think it's the end of the Enlightenment Project. I think it's a mistake, and I hope I explained this in the book. It's a mistake to mistake the undertow for the wave. We have had a wave of ongoing progress and revolutions that have helped human beings enormously over the last hundreds of years. They do produce undertows. They do produce backlashes. In the end, the wave overwhelms the undertow.
Thank you very much. Just one thing does occur to me. What if he loses, though? A lot of people talk about January 6th, and we have been talking about revolutions. I mean, America survived January 6th, but a lot of people make a big deal out of it. They say this pierced the myth that we all respect the Constitution above anything else. Are you afraid of a Bastille moment?
I'm very afraid of one, but I also will note that look what happened on January 6th. It was terrible. He tried to do all the things he tried to do, but something like 55 courts ruled against all his challenges, including courts with Republican judges, Republican appointed judges, including courts that had Trump appointed judges. The vice president refused to go along with what he wanted to do. Secretaries of state in various states that were Republican states refused to go along with what he wanted to do. And ultimately, while he's made a lot of song and dance about it and raised a lot of money off people's indignation, he has accepted it. He is not fielding an army to Cromwell like to try and take over the country. So I think sometimes when people say the system didn't work, look, nobody said that people would always be nice about these things. But I think the system did work. Biden is president. He is governing. But we are a deeply divided country, and that means the politics has become a blood sport in a way that it wasn't. And I think we'll see more of that blood sport And you're right, by the way, there are only two options. Trump will win or he will claim to have won. Those are the only two options we have, which to my mind means that either way it's going to be a nightmare for us, for those of us who don't want that to happen.
Fareed Zakaria, thank you very much. If there's anything else you'd like to add that you think we didn't touch on, please spit it out.
I urge the wise and intellectually curious readers of The Telegraph to buy my book.
a revolutionary statement, no less. Fareed, thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
It's pleasure. What a stimulating conversation.
Now to Israel, where after 8 months of war in Gaza and no end in sight, the government is facing a domestic political crisis. I spoke to Nicole Smith about how a row about Orthodox men's exemption from military service could bring down Benjamin Netanyahu's government. I'm joined now by Nicole Smith, our correspondent currently in Israel. I was going to say Jerusalem, but I think you're actually on the road somewhere outside Jerusalem. Nicole, where are you exactly?
That's right. We're just outside Tel Aviv, where we've gone to a school that's been run by an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, which is actually quite a radical school here. It's teaching young or ultra-Orthodox men how to join the army, and also it's giving them technical training as well and technical expertise. And there's a few hundred students here. And this is very outside of the mainstream of the ultra-Orthodox community. And this has become a big political issue in Israel over recent weeks. Well, it's been a big political issue for decades, but it's really come to a head in recent months because a large section of the ultra-Orthodox community are exempt from conscription to the military because they're studying the Torah. And the military at the moment is really short on troops. The country's at war, and this is a political issue that now is hitting the headlines every day. And it's a very tough issue that Prime Minister Netanyahu's government has to deal with, and it could ultimately bring about the downfall of his coalition.
These are tensions that have always been there in Israeli society, but why are they coming to the fore now? Is it about the war in Gaza, or is something else going on?
Well, basically, you've had this situation since 1948, when a few hundred ultra-Orthodox students were allowed an exemption from conscription to study the Torah. Since then, the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community has really boomed. So it's now about 13% of the population. And so you now have tens of thousands of young men of conscription age who are eligible to be conscripted to the military, but they have this exemption. And for many years, for many decades, politicians have grappled with how to deal with this issue and how to meet the requests of the Haredi community and how to satisfy their demands, while at the same time also addressing what the majority of the public are saying on this. And at a time of war, a lot of the public are saying, well, our sons are going to fight, our sons are risking shedding their blood, but, tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox young men have this exemption, and there's certainly been a lot of resentment building up and anger about it. And so for the Prime Minister, he has ultra-Orthodox members of his coalition, and for them this is a red line. If they pull out of his coalition, then that could lead to its collapse. So he is trying to appease them. He is also under pressure from the public that this issue has to be addressed and dealt with. The military have also indicated that they need more troops, that they think that, there should be conscription for ultra-Orthodox men. And so all of these things are now converging at a time of crisis. And so what's happened politically is that there has been a bill on the table that to look at the issue of conscription and to increase it in small numbers among the Haredi community. That has been sitting there since 2022. The Prime Minister has recently revived it, but he's revived it at the same time that the Supreme Court are about to make a ruling on the question that could ultimately mean that young Haredi men would have to be conscripted. And so when the Prime Minister brought this back to the table last week, it was seen by many of his opponents as quite a cynical move, that they saw this as a stalling tactic to keep legislation in the hands of the Parliament and out of the hands of the judges, and to just keep prolonging the legislative process and not actually deal with the question on the table. And so he has been strongly criticised over this. There have been a lot of protests this week. Protest groups have called for a week of resistance, and we saw tens of thousands on the streets of Tel Aviv on Saturday night. There's been huge protests in Jerusalem, outside the Knesset, outside the Prime Minister's house. And this is one of the issues that people are protesting about. A number of major protest groups who are calling for more action to be done to bring the hostages home. They're calling for early elections. Some of them want an end to the war. You have different factions. So the protests that I've been to, it's been a range of ages. It's been old people, young people, families. I've spoken to one particular group, which is led by the mothers of serving soldiers who are saying enough is enough. You know, we want our children to come home now. They don't see a direction to the war. They think that the government has no strategy. And just speaking to them, they said in the first 6 months, we understood that our children had to go to war. We hated it. We were terrified for them. But we understood that the country had to defend itself after the Hamas attacks on October 7th. But now they said in the past couple of months, they feel like politics is taking over, that the government has no strategy, and that politicians are really trying to save their own skins rather than make the right decisions about the future of the war.
Incredible domestic political turmoil in Israel while the war is still going on. Nicola, can you bring us up to date on the war itself? What is happening in Gaza? We've also heard a lot of saber rattling on the northern border. Again, where are we?
Well, we've seen no progress publicly on the ceasefire deal in Gaza. So there's still a major disagreement over the terms of the ceasefire, of withdrawal. Hamas has asked for certain guarantees about Israeli troops being fully withdrawn, about a permanent end to the war. So we haven't seen any movement on that. We have heard some reports from the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF in Rafah, in the south of Gaza, that they believe that that particular operation could be winding down within a month. In the north, the situation is becoming more critical, even more tense. We've seen a lot of fire from missiles, rockets coming over from Hezbollah. It's very much linked to the ceasefire in Gaza. As we have not seen any progress on that, then things are just becoming more hostile in the north between Hezbollah and Israeli forces. This week, there was a US envoy who came over to try and calm the situation down. He went both to Israel, to Lebanon. We haven't really heard much about what progress he made there. And we had the leader of Hezbollah yesterday issuing a video saying that he may also start targeting Cyprus. So there are real concerns that if there is no ceasefire in Gaza and the situation in the north will not calm down, and that it will evolve into a wider war, perhaps a regional war.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of The Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph Foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Dagahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.